Well, good evening and welcome to the live stream here on the 15th of October 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. And we're going to have a really interesting conversation tonight about all things political and specifically around misinformation and disinformation and perhaps some broader issues too. Just before I bring Robbie and indeed John Adams in, let me just remind you that we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and observations in as we go. And if you've got a specific question you'd like to ask us, then if you use that walk the world, that'll make sure it gets into my queue. The chat gets very busy, so I don't necessarily follow all the threads, but if you use that walk the world, then I'm going to see it. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to get your question to the top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here, always greatly appreciated. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think this is a really important set of issues to discuss. And your financial support really makes a big difference to what we can do. Anyway, having done that, let me bring our guests in. Robbie, hello. How are you doing?
Excellent, Martin. Especially because I'm sitting on a bit of good news about our campaign to stop the misinformation, disinformation bill, but we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, great. And John, you're on as well. Hello.
Hello, Martin. How are you and Robbie?
Yeah, doing pretty well, actually. Nice to see you on and to see your face rather than just the black screen with John Adams on. So you've you've appeared in person. Great to see you.
Yes, like I finally taken the mask off. But Martin, I must ask before. Martin, I must ask before we start, in relation to the moderation of the chat, will misinformation and disinformation be removed from the chat tonight?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Now, who defines misinformation and disinformation? To me, this is actually the heart of the issue, right?
You can't remove it. I like reading Cookie Boy's comments.
Yeah. Well, so I actually have a little bit of editorial control insofar that the chat that gets thrown on screen, I do that. So, I'm making positive or negative editing decisions as we go. And to my mind, Robbie, I don't know what you think, but this is the heart of the issue, right? What is truth? Who defines what truth is? And to an extent, truth is in the eye of the beholder, possibly. But as somebody said many, many years ago, of all the different forms of political discourse, actually free speech is probably the most powerful way of making sure that truth doesn't get crushed.
Well, this question is your bailiwick, isn't it? Because I don't know if your regular viewers appreciate, Martin, that your secret hidden talent is that you're actually a philosopher. And I mean, this question of what is truth is the subject of philosophy for literally thousands and thousands of years, right? And the idea that you get to the 21st century and a decade and a half into the 21st century, and suddenly the politicians of that era are so well qualified that they can't only just define truth absolutely, they can put it in legislation, is going to make every other person who's ever debated this issue for thousands of years roll in their grave, frankly. Now, that's not to say there's not truth out there to be found, but it can be a slippery concept sometimes. Sometimes the best you can do is to get as close as you can to it. And sometimes you can be absolutely convinced of something, genuinely so, and then experience will teach you later that, oh, well, actually, I got that wrong, or looking at it this way is wrong. And you can only really arrive at that if you've got the freedom to talk things through, speak your mind, be challenged in what you believe, and you'll arrive at the best understanding you can. And that's the danger of this bill. It'll suppress so much of that, because so much of that happens online now. That's just the way the world works. And it's going to suppress a lot of it.
Yes, and one of the interesting observations that there was a significant battery of hearings on Friday in Canberra. It's actually on for about 7 hours. In fact, it's available on YouTube because now Canberra actually puts its sessions up on YouTube so people can watch it. I'll make a show on that actually in the next few days and put up some of the highlights because it was really interesting. There were 4 themes that came through to my mind. The first one was how the mainstream media was trying to sort of say, we've got some, universal right to be the harbinger of truth and everybody else hasn't, right? So that there's a battle between the mainstream media and everybody else. Secondly, when you come to fact checking, well, who actually checks the facts? And surely the fact checkers are as biased as everybody else. So in a way, either they get paid to do it or there's a doctrine that underpins what they do. Thirdly, of course, everybody recognizes that the social media and all of those things is a very critical force now. And so there was a big debate about that. But for the key theme for me that came out of these hearings was the notion of censorship. And, there were a number of people from Channel 9 on one side and from the IPA who basically said this disinformation bill is censorship.
Yep. I was impressed that they nailed it that way, even though, as I tweeted, I'm not exactly a fan of the IPA, but I thought they're traditional liberals, so I would expect them to come down on this position. Except bear in mind, I hope they're a positive force on the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party actually initiated this bill when they were in government. They have bailed out of it now because they're not dumb and they've seen the size of the backlash. But given the international commitments that are driving this bill, I would expect the Liberals will if they win government, they'll look for another way to achieve the same outcome, because I don't trust them for a second. But nevertheless, the IPA were very hard hitting on that, and there was a funny segment where the chair of the inquiry took it upon herself to correct their testimony, and instead of letting them respond to her correction, she tried to shut it down, and that literally blew up in her face. You can go and look at my Twitter feed to see a video of that. And her critics were able to point out, well, hang on, if you're shutting this down our right to respond to you, this is how this bill would work in practice, right? And they had a cold, to be honest. They had a cold. What I was interested in from that hearing, Martin, is that a couple of things. Not many people actually, especially some of the politicians, truly know the significance of this bill and what's actually in it. This is a rushed process. Did you notice the number of times, I haven't mentioned this to you yet, John, or I might have, the chair kept apologising to the witnesses because they were all asked to table an opening statement, but she apologised to them because they'd been given very little notice.
36 hours. 36 hours.
36 hours.
Yeah.
Notice to be witnesses at this hearing. This is a rushed process, but I think that's come down in our favour, because by rushing it, we've actually got the breaking news. I'll just break the news and then we can let Mr. Adams say something. He's dying there. The breaking news is that a friend of all of ours, and John's met him, you haven't, Martin, but he's a fan of yours. We've talked about him on your show many times. So the Citizens Party has a great supporter and activist in Brisbane named Garth Gilbert. And Garth is an angry but thoughtful Vietnam vet, and he doesn't take crap from anybody, and he especially the politicians. So he's very good. He's very good at making phone calls and really getting under their skin. Anyway, today Garth did what Garth tends to do, which gets him mentioned on these shows. He called the committee, and remember, we only had 7 days to make a submission, right? Or a bit over 7 days. By the time people realised it was 7 days, he called the committee and he said, "Why you only publish submissions from organisations? Doesn't the average Joe get to have a say?" Something like that. Anyway, the person from the committee secretariat said, "Oh, well, no, it's just because we're overwhelmed, we're snowed under with all the work we've got to do." And Garth said, "Why? What's the problem?" And the answer was, "Well, we've got more than 15,000 submissions to work through." 15,000 submissions in a week. Now, to put that in, that is mind-boggling. To put that in perspective, go back to what we did on the cash ban. Now, with the cash ban bill, we had a couple of weeks to make submissions to the exposure draft of that. We generated about 44 or 4,600 submissions in a couple of weeks. That was brilliant at the time. Then there was a Senate inquiry into that legislation, and we generated 2,600 submissions to that Senate inquiry. And we would have had more than 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to generate those submissions, 2,600. With this bill, I had a sense last year that the public reaction had gone up another notch, because the first sign of that was the exposure draft of the bill that was released in October last year received 24,000 submissions. 24,000. Now that would have blown out all their gaskets. It certainly got the Liberal Party's attention. Senator Jane Hume, when she was justifying last week why the Liberals have dropped their support for this bill, she cited that. So that was the exposure draft. Now, in 1 week, we've generated 15,000 submissions plus to this inquiry. That's going to rock the Parliament. We'll see if it's we'll see if it's enough.
And
what do you reckon, John?
The moral of the story is, of course, that if you give a very short window, actually it's much more focused, gets people's attention. So in fact, I would suggest that their little window created that opportunity much more than if they
did us a favour.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yep. No mucking around. You got to do it now, and they did it.
Yeah. What do you think, John? 15,000.
Well, I mean, I am struggling to understand, Martin, what this government is about. I mean, we're headed towards an election, if not at the end of this year, probably around March, April next year. For the first time, I think since the election, Labor is now trailing in the two-party preferred, according to News Poll, 51-49 to the coalition. Peter Dutton is highly unpopular across the country, and yet his party is on the verge of pulling off a miracle. So Robbie knows this quite well because we've debated this on multiple occasions. Since Federation, there's only been one government that's been thrown out after one term of government, and that was Scullin in 1931. Joseph Lyons, my hero, was able to win that election. And every government since beforehand and since then has been able to at least serve 2 terms. This government has completely failed on all fronts. The country has gone backwards. They have achieved nothing. There's only one thing I would say that Albanese has achieved, and that is the release of Assange. 12 months ago, I would have said 2 things. I would have said that the NAC was also an achievement, but the NAC has been rendered completely ineffective and useless. And no doubt, Martin, on the interest of the people, we'll talk about the NAC at some point in the future. But there is no justification, as we did some recent shows on the interest of the people. There is no policy basis for this legislation. They cited a report in the explanatory memorandum. The report talked about misinformation and offensive content. No one in the report wanted misinformation to be removed, and only 34% of people who were surveyed as part of that report said that they wanted offensive content to be taken down, which is obviously a minority. So there is no basis for this, and this issue of so as Robbie said, it is censorship, but the argument is that some censorship is necessary because some people can be deluded into believing false things, and if they believe those false things, that can lead to some social harms. And one of the examples that was given, which is a very interesting example, Martin, is that during the pandemic, supposedly people in Iran believed that if they consumed pure alcohol, it would cleanse their body of the virus. And so supposedly 800 people in Iran died due to alcohol poisoning because of online misinformation. Now, one big issue I have is that, so can people be deluded to believing false things? Absolutely. It's it happens on social media all the time. Happy to be some of the audience may be upset about this, but one of the people who was the massive purveyor of misinformation, disinformation is a guy called Ricardo Bossi. Ricardo Bossi was a hero of the the, I guess, the anti-vax movement, the anti-lockdown movement during the pandemic. He gave a speech in 2021. And as soon as he gave that speech, I knew he was a fraudster. I called him out. Robbie called him out in 2022. We were attacked. And we were called as being jealous and stuff. And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 months that that all of his claims were proven to be false. So misinformation, disinformation does actually occur online. It happens in the government. It happens in the mainstream media. But the question is, should it all be taken down, or should we be allowed to make our own individual judgments, and then be able to make the decisions that we wish to make, either rightly or wrongly? Now, I guess the government may say, well, if you believe something to be false and it leads to someone dying, like how people did in Iran, or that's not good for society. But again, the government's documentation is full of foreign examples. If that was all over social media in Australia, if you have pure alcohol, you can be cleansed of the virus, I don't think Australians would buy that. I think we're smart enough not to believe such fantasy. But no,
well, we have more.
Sorry, go Robbie.
I was just going to say we have more experience with alcohol to start with.
Well, absolutely. Well, that's a good point, because Iran's an Islamic country and they're not used to drinking alcohol. Maybe they understood that claim to be completely different to us. But no, the thing is that this is a hopeless government. They've achieved nothing. They're pursuing policy agendas and priorities that the Australian people don't want. The urgent business of the nation is not being addressed. And I hope they get thrown out at the next election, not because I'm a sycophant former Liberal advisor, but it's just, this government is just hopeless from top to bottom.
Absolutely. And it is interesting, of course, the latest poll puts the two parties pretty much line ball, despite the fact that the other side of politics probably doesn't have a huge run as well. And as Vic said, what's the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth? About 6 months, what was at one stage regarded as unlikely to be true turned out possibly to be true. So in a way, that's another example of, allowing time to pass and not to try to sort of shut things down. But I guess the question I've got, and Robbie, I'll maybe come back to you on this first. Why now? Why did this bill come back now? Because as you say, it was actually tabled some time ago, got huge amounts of negativity thrown at it, and it disappeared, and then it came back. So why now?
Well, that is an excellent question in light of what John just said, because what's Albanese think he's going to achieve with this bill in terms of he wants to get re-elected in less than a year, 7 months or something, and why is he wasting time on a bill like this? He's on a hiding to nothing, but that's what he's done his whole political term so far. What has he actually put out and pursued as a vision that actually helps people in the here and now? Nothing. He's so weak that in trying not to upset anybody, he's gone and upset everybody. So everyone has turned on him. And then here's a bill that last year they pulled it because it got the 24,000 submissions to the exposure draft and was roundly denounced by everybody. And they brought it back saying we've improved it. And there's two big changes. One is, I think their little token change is they've removed government from the excluded sources of disinformation. So presumably this can apply to the government, but that's a cheap one because ACMA will never apply to the government anyway. But they've inserted this thing in there that you can't criticize the banks and the financial system, right? And that's an improvement. I mean, talk about a red rag to a bull. Tell Aussies you can't criticize the banks, right? This bank bashing is a national pastime in this country. Mostly because the banks deserve it, but partly because we're Aussies and people love it. So why? Well, from everything we've looked at, I'm convinced tracing this narrative of misinformation and disinformation in the way it's used now actually goes back to Trump's election in 2016, because that was an unexpected election. And instead of, here was the most unlikely candidate in American history defeated the most entitled candidate in American history, and the person that was universally ordained by all the media as the most qualified candidate in American history, in Hillary Clinton. If you don't remember that, go back and have a look. She was called the most qualified candidate in American history. And of course, and because of that, she was definitely going to break the glass ceiling and all those kind of symbolic things that go along with that. And Donald Trump beat her. Now, about 3 weeks before the election, the filmmaker Michael Moore predicted, and he's a Democrat, he didn't vote for Trump, he predicted Trump would win. And he gave this very electrifying speech at a film festival to warn people this guy is going to win. And he just to summarize it, he basically said, look, the average former industrial worker in the Midwest who's now unemployed, who's lost all sense of a future, can't even afford healthcare, the whole system has failed them. And they know that Donald Trump is no solution. But to them, he's a human wrecking ball, and they just love the idea they're going to send this human wrecking ball and smash everything up. That's what he said. And Trump got elected. Now, instead of the Democrats soul-searching and going, what did we do to our base of supporters such that they would vote for this guy? Oh, no, couldn't do that. The party of Wall Street and the military-industrial complex literally could not do that because they're not a real political party. In my view, democracy as the West practices it in this holier-than-thou way, we're the superior people in the world, we practice democracy and we can go bomb every other country who doesn't, is fake, is entirely fake. They're owned by Wall Street and the military-industrial complex, and so they literally couldn't do any soul-searching. So they said, well, we've got to blame something else. And they blamed Russian disinformation. That's where the narrative started. They blamed Julian Assange for leaking her emails, which the content of the emails was horrific. That's why she lost. The emails showed she was a veritable monster. But no, deflect from the emails. Let's come up with a narrative that this was a Russian disinformation campaign. Now, everyone who's followed the narrative through now knows it's been entirely debunked. There was never any truth to it. But what it did, it set off a chain reaction around the Western world, including here in Australia. We had Senate inquiries into online misinformation going back to 2019 in the wake, like after the Christchurch massacre. Morrison got together with Jacinda Ardern, and it was all about, we've got to police the content of the internet, et cetera, et cetera. There were Senate inquiries into that, and they always said that one component was foreign disinformation. So that's been that's the subject now of international memorandums of understanding and between countries. Our communications minister went to the UK earlier this year to sign an MOU with the UK, which has really weaponized this. We published a couple of weeks ago how the UK has a counter disinformation unit that was started in 2019, and it was turbocharged during COVID to manipulate public opinion in COVID in the name of countering disinformation. The UK example showed that this particular unit works with a UK military outfit called 77th Brigade, and 77th Brigade was started in 2016 as an information warfare unit for places like Syria, where the UK was supporting the regime change operation. And when it was started, the UK government's commitment was this 77th Brigade's information warfare would never be used against British citizens. In June 2020, in the middle of COVID, an army spokesman admitted that 77th Brigade was being used to shape the messaging for British citizens in COVID, right? Using COVID as the excuse. So the British have actually been ahead of the game on this. They're the masters of wartime propaganda and misinformation anyway, going back to World War I. That everyone knows about MI6 and MI5. There used to be a division called MI7 back in World War I, which was the British disinformation warfare, information warfare section. It's so advanced now in the UK that people are actually being jailed for posts they make online. these are posts where they're inciting, people to get involved in protests that have turned violent, etc. But you can tell by the way the British police are talking about this that their bias is to not really protecting the public, but to suppressing the use of the internet to rapidly disseminate information. So that's the country that our communications minister signed a memorandum of understanding with back in February to protect us from online harms. And this is all under the rubric of the Five Eyes, etc. And to conclude, that what Trump achieved in an unlikely election outcome, all at least Western countries are experiencing something like that in the rise of third-party candidates or non-major party candidates. The two-party system is incredibly weak and eroding because those two parties, who in Australia like to call themselves the parties of government, no longer deliver for the public. And so the public is getting cheesed off. And so they're turning to other electoral possibilities. And where do they find them? Usually online. That's where the information is being disseminated. Social media has allowed that in a way that we've never seen before in history. And so this is freaking out these establishment parties, and they've come up with this narrative that harmful social media disinformation, misinformation must be reined in, because it's the only way they can suppress that dissemination of information that neither they nor the corporate mainstream media, who previously had this role of controlling most information in society, can anymore. So they've got to suppress it.
Yeah, and just on that, in September, the UN held one of their, I think it was 25th anniversary celebrations, and including on that was this thing called the Pact for the Future Global Digital Compact and Declaration on Future Generations. It's quite a long document. It's called the 2030 Agenda. But one of the things that's also in that is also the idea of needing to control information, and particularly through digital means, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, they also in this document talk about an international financial system, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of issues. And I guess my point, Robbie, is that, the Five Eyes, the UK, the UN, the World Economic Forum, all of these technocrats who actually seem to have this idea of how the world should be running are setting an agenda. But it's still down to local individual parliaments and democracies to accept or reject such a proposition. It's just a pity that in Australia it does look as though Michelle Rowlands has basically said, well, we got a mandate from what we signed, It's almost like they're looking for an excuse.
Well, there's a precedent, which is going back to, for the way Labor might think about this, going back to the 1980s, the Franklin Dam campaign, where the state government of Tasmania wanted to dam the Franklin River. And the federal government has no constitutional authority in this area, except they invented one by using the fact that Australia was a party to international treaties to protect the environment. That is the national government. They used the external affairs clause of the Constitution to override that state government. They stopped the Franklin below Gordon Dam being built. And that made a lot of people happy, and it started the Green Party, bless their hearts. But it was a ruse by the feds to do that. And that has become a very common thing. Now, they don't often have something that has the power of a treaty, but for instance, another more recent one was the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, was similarly done under the authority of the External Affairs Clause of the Constitution, and the fact that Australia was signatory to the treaty. So but they don't really need a treaty because when you've got the two parties conditioned like this, they're so oriented to these international discussions that go on at places like the UN. If you can, and it's funny, if you can get something up through the UN bureaucracy, but probably half the countries in the world aren't really the political bodies of half the countries in the world aren't paying attention to it, but it gets up in the bureaucracy of the UN, then our governments, and it seems especially Labor governments, will just automatically assume, okay, let's bring that into power here. Now, they've got to get it through Parliament. And so that's where we can stop them, because nothing the UN passes is law over Australia. Nothing the WEF discusses is law over Australia. It's got to get through Parliament. But there's sort of an assumption, we're party to these discussions, and so we've made these commitments, so we assume it's got to be done here. And if both parties work on that together, then it automatically does get done here. In this particular case, one party is more keen on getting elected than the other one, seemingly. So they've dropped this bill like a hot potato, but the other party is sticking with it, and it'll need the support of the Greens to get it through. But yeah, it's an orientation to that international agenda.
And it's worth highlighting, isn't it, that the World Economic Forum, the UN, they're all still neoliberal driven in terms of intent. So, the ideas that are actually powering how they're thinking about how the world should be are defined by those neoliberal values that have proved to be, defective over the last 20 to 30 years.
Yep, and the entrenched bureaucrats are the last to get the memo on that, Martin.
Yeah, exactly right. So I guess it comes back to what John said. John, you said basically that the Australian Parliament is in some disarray, and particularly the current incumbents. But what happens then when both sides of politics basically are sort of, looking pretty defective? Have we got an effective democracy in Australia, John? What do you think?
Well, Martin, what I was going to say is I probably want to make a couple of points about what Robbie said. So I do agree with Robbie that this whole agenda has come about because the establishment doesn't like to lose votes. And obviously 2016 with Trump was a big one. And Robbie said that it started with Trump. I actually disagree. I think it actually started where you're living, Martin. It actually started in regional and rural England, because before the 2016 election, it was Brexit. And everyone, from the mainstream media to the polls to the ruling elite, the European Union, they all thought that Brexit was going to fail, and Farage was successful. And I remember, I think a couple of years after the Brexit vote, there was a movie done about how the Brexit campaign was run, and they used sophisticated data mining. Again, this is how the movie portrayed the Farage campaign. They portrayed the Brexit campaign as using sophisticated data mining, pushing mis and disinformation, particularly about immigration, and all sorts of foreign immigrants coming into the UK. And the movie portrayed that some of those claims were false, and it was immigration that really turned that vote over. And the ruling elite in the UK probably hasn't forgiven Farage and others for his ability to win that vote. And yet Martin, again, I don't have the specific the regional voting for England, but I would assume that where you're living in Bath, a good chunk of your neighbours voted for Brexit because I think Scotland voted to stay in the EU. I think Northern Ireland and Wales probably did the same, but England was resoundingly, they won out. And when you look at the breakdown of England, I think London was pro-EU and everything out of London was anti-EU. And so obviously the ruling elite in London believed that your neighbours in Bath were victims of mis and disinformation pushed by Farage about immigration, and en masse they voted to get out. So I think it really started where you're living, Martin, and obviously because Brexit was a very big issue that then fed into the Trump campaign, and Farage came over to the United States and spoke with Trump in 2016. And then obviously that led into the election there. So before we look, I do have a couple other points, but can we address that point first about the role of Brexit, which obviously chronologically was before the 2016 election? And I don't know, since you've been back in the UK, Martin, whether you've been able to speak to some of your neighbours about whether they voted to stay in the EU or whether they decided to leave the EU, and was it due to claims of immigration by Farage that triggered their vote to say we want out?
Well, I can give you, a significant answer on that insofar that there were some areas in the UK that voted to come out of the European Union and for Brexit. They tended to be the disadvantaged areas, particularly in the west and the north of the UK, particularly in England, less so in some of the other places. And they felt that they had had a really, really bad deal over the last 20 to 30 years because of the very bad execution of politics in the UK. And they were looking for anything must be better than what we've currently got. So it was actually a running away from rather than necessarily to something that was actually clear. And, the claims that were made by the pro-Brexit people were completely outlandish. So a lot of the value that was going to be released never appeared. But a lot of people who voted were actually those who felt really disenfranchised and, frankly, economically disadvantaged. Now, in the southwest of England, actually, it's some of the more independent parties that held sway, and they still do hold sway. So Bath is not owned by either side of the major parties. It's actually a third party. And so it was much closer in the southwest and a few other areas too. But it was this bulk of the northern English suburbs where, from Birmingham up through Manchester and places like that, and over to the west and then over to the east, where people felt completely disempowered and felt that really the politicians had lost the plot.
Yeah,
I see. Now,
hang on,
sorry,
Robbie.
Just quickly, John. I just want to agree with, now that you've raised Brexit, clearly, you're actually right, and that was also blamed on Russian disinformation. Just for the record, the Trump thing became a bigger deal because they just didn't relent on the Trump narrative. But certainly that was where this narrative started, the Brexit campaign, because it was such a shocking result, and it was followed up later that year by the Trump election result.
Sure. Now, I mean, in terms of the question you asked before, Martin, is that why are we doing this now? There was only an article, when was it? In 2 or 3 days ago in the Australian, Professor Megan Davis, who was the co-author of The Voice, has basically said that we need these laws to stop any future lies and any future referendum. So the people who lost The Voice are blaming the No to The Voice campaign as pushing mis and disinformation. And yet the problem with The Voice was that they could not explain what it would do. They couldn't explain the full range of consequences if the Constitution was changed. And the campaign started 60% saying yes to The Voice, and then it ended up being 60% no. And the 20% that switched, they switched because Albanese and his acolytes could not actually clearly articulate in simple terms why this was needed and what was the full range of consequences. And because they kept on fluffing about the vibe and this is the good thing to do and this is moral, that confusion. But let me say this: that vacuum provided the No campaign to create enough doubt, and this was not just fake doubt or misinformation doubt. This was legitimate doubt as to the full range of consequences of this change, and that's why they lost. And they can't accept that they lost. And now you've got the co-author of The Voice saying, we want to now alter we want to now change the law so that if there's a future referendum, we can stop the lies from happening, according to them. And obviously, if we did this on the interest of the people, we went through all the categories of what they define mis and disinformation, and the electoral process and referendums is one of those categories that they want to target. So you've got that. But then obviously, Robbie talked about the Greens, and the Greens being an important party in the Senate as to how this is going to go down if it goes to a vote. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has said that they want to stop the Trumpian lies. And Robbie may want to speak to this, but there are people in the Greens who still believe in the Russian narrative, that the Russia impacted the 2016 election, which is just completely bogus. But also they've said, well, we're coming up to an Australian federal election, and left-wing parties, including the Greens, are supposedly concerned about mis and disinformation impacting the vote. And so they're saying, for the sake of, on the basis of we lost the voice, on the basis of Trump's a liar, on the basis that we're going towards a Australian election, we need to ensure that fake information is taken off the internet, so we have more informed voting. And yet the ruling elite are the ones pushing a lot of fake information in terms of all sorts of things. And people like you and me and Robbie have no legitimate voice in the public square. So no, the reality is that this all comes down to, I think, the point Robbie made. They keep on losing critical votes. They don't like that they lose. They can't accept that their arguments are weaker, and they blame the other side for supposedly lying, and they want to basically shut them up. And that's what it comes down to. So rather than actually coming up with better ideas, they just want to basically take the competition off the field effectively. And and here's the thing. So even though both of you said that the 1 week actually played in our favor, if this was a trivial issue, the 1 week would have had no impact, because this is the biggest assault on free speech since the arrival of the First Fleet. I mean, because that is the case. I mean, this is why so many people are worked up about this, and whoever is advising Albanese, at some point he's got to realise that he's driving his government into the ditch. He's driving his government into opposition, and if he doesn't want to actually govern properly, well then it's high time we throw them out and get some new blood in, and we try to move on. Martin, I'm lost for words. This is the worst government I've ever seen, and Morrison and Frydenberg were a complete disaster. I mean, in terms of in 2020, their economic response to COVID has bankrupted the country, and we're not going to recover economically from the stimulus of 2020. This is going to be with us for at least 1 or 2 generations. So Morrison and Frydenberg have a lot to answer for, but I look at this current government, and they're either as worse as Morrison and Frydenberg, or they're even in some cases even more bad. And I'm just so disappointed that we can't get effective leadership in Canberra. And these politicians, look, I deal with these politicians all the time. Robbie deals with them all the time. I mean, Robbie and I are in Canberra every month. We knock on these people's doors, and Robbie and I keep on banging our heads against the wall and saying, why are these people so stupid? I mean, I've worked in Parliament. Look, I know what good political operators look like. 10 years ago when I was in Parliament, you had some half-decent, shrewd political operators, but who were also people who were serious about public policy. I look at the current crop. Most of these people have tremendously poor political skills, and they just have diluted ideas about public policy, and they're not serious at all. It's just I mean, what can I say? I mean, well, yeah. I mean, maybe for another day.
What you're actually saying is true. The people in that building are the most propagandized, the most misinformed, disinformed people in the country. That's why we run into politicians that still believe in the Trump Russia narrative. If you've actually bothered to follow social media, you'll know that's false. That's been debunked, but doesn't get reported in the mainstream media. And so those clowns in the building are the biggest victims of that much more real disinformation.
But Robbie, here's the thing. Can I just say about Trump Russia? The Bill Barr appointed a special counsel called John Durham. The Durham report, which has been publicized by U.S. mainstream media, has concluded that Trump Russia was fake. It was all paid by Hillary. They paid for the so-called Steele dossier, which was the trigger for the FBI investigation. And the FBI knew the information in the dossier was fake. and it was unreliable, and they still used it to get search warrant or surveillance warrants for the FISA court, etc. So I mean, the fact that you've got senators in the Greens who still believe in Trump Russia, I mean, they're living in a fantasy land, and part of it is because we've got. Again, the one thing, Martin, and we may want to move on to this point is there's quite a few people, even in some of the submissions that have been published online, to say that the exemption for mainstream journalists should not be granted. And I think it's a point I've made to Robbie privately. I think Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has also sort of is bending towards that point, so that if we are to move towards this sort of regime, everyone has to be subject to the law. There can't be any carve-outs because the mainstream media in this country is some of the biggest bullshitters going around. And, top of the list for me is Sarah Ferguson, the host of the 7:30 Report. I mean, in 2017, she did the interview with Hillary Clinton, in which Hillary accused Assange of being a subsidiary of Russian intelligence, not challenged on that point at all. And then in 2019, she did a three-part series using taxpayers' money on the Trump-Russia narrative, which was all fake. And I bet you my bottom dollar she knew it was fake, and she still ran it because now I suspect she is an agent of foreign intelligence, but I can't prove that. But there are people in the mainstream media, and Robbie, maybe you want to talk about Nick McKenzie. Nick McKenzie is repeatedly praised as a respected journalist, one of the leading journalists in the country, and there are multiple court cases where he has been proven to be a categorical liar, and he has lost many defamation cases. So, we need to clean out the mainstream media, and we need to ensure that we have accurate information both on domestic and international issues, so that you don't have idiot politicians believing that the Russians impacted the 26th election, and the whole thing was just a psychological warfare operation by Hillary.
Exactly. Democracy is supposed to be a self-correcting mechanism because a bad government who doesn't figure out it's bad gets voted out. And if they can come up with a narrative to explain away why they've been voted out instead of reading the room, reading the public, then they're not a democratic government. I would agree with you that there's no way there's any justification for excluding the mainstream media from a regime to censor mis and disinformation. However, I think that once you agree to that, then you have to agree that, hang on, if we're all under censorship, then that's the worst possible outcome. It just means that if we should read it the other way, that if one group should be, if there's a justification to exclude one, you exclude all, because that particular group does not deserve to be excluded. They have no right. They have not earned the right to be excluded. They do not speak truth to power. In the case of Nick McKenzie, so Nick McKenzie I've seen him described as the best investigative reporter in Australia. If you don't know who he is, his most recent work is the CFMEU story, which has led to an incredibly heavy-handed crackdown by Albanese, maybe with an ulterior motive, because the CFMEU is a different faction from the Labor Party to him. They have very heavy-handed crackdown on not just on the CFMEU, but all registered organisations. Like it's targeting the CFMEU, but the power is using could be applied to all registered organisations, including theoretically political parties. Right. So the CFMEU story has become the pretext for something much more serious. Nick McKenzie did that story. And when we saw it, I spoke to my union buddies and said, well, if you want to fight back, look at this guy. He's a liar. And he's been sued multiple times for multiple stories. The only lawsuit he hasn't lost was the one where he wasn't the only defendant, but it was also included Chris Masters, I believe, which was the one about Ben Roberts-Smith. That's the only one he hasn't lost. Every other one he has lost, including against your gold mate,
Peter Schiff.
Peter Schiff, right? He lost against Peter Schiff. But there was a story he did in 2017 where he called Power and Influence, which was supposed about the Chinese infiltration of Australia. He lost 2 lawsuits over that story, and one of them was incredibly blatant. He interviewed a Chinese student at ANU, and he then cut up the interview to make it look like she was saying that she was informing on her fellow students to the Chinese embassy, when she had literally said the opposite. And when that was proven, because the proper transcript had to be released, they settled with her and took you can't find that show online now because of it. That guy deliberately crafted a lie as one of the most Australia's foreign influence transparency scheme and our foreign interference laws come from that four corner story, and it was based on lies by Nick McKenzie. That's who this guy is. That's the kind of misinformation, disinformation he specializes in, yet he's exempt from this regime. And it's this kind of critical discussion that that is in danger of being suppressed by this regime. I mean, that's, people have to, but like I said, I think the conclusion to draw is, okay, if that particularly uncredible sector of the population is exempt, everyone should be exempt. I just want to say something briefly about the Greens, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Sarah Hanson-Young is clearly biased towards supporting this bill. However, what John just said is true. She has raised repeatedly, why the exemption for the mainstream media. The only, I don't know, I can't imagine, unless Albo put that in there as an ambit claim that they could drop. I can't imagine that they will drop it. But if they do drop it, then we probably have better chance to defeat this bill if the mainstream media comes on the public side against it. Right, at a certain point, the Labor Party will realise they're on a hiding to nothing. But without that, the question is, will the Greens be persuaded because of this disinformation in their minds about things like Trump-Russia? Will they be persuaded on balance to actually support it, maybe put up a few token amendments, and if they don't pass, they'll support it anyway? Because it comes down to them. This bill cannot pass without them, and the public needs to turn their attention to them. And we've got more than a month. What is it? 6 weeks probably, or 5 weeks before Parliament sits again. There's a 2-week sitting at the end of November, and if there's a chance to stop this bill, we can only stop it by getting the Greens not to support it. Now, the problem there is the Greens are not like other political parties in the sense that they actually have a very strong division of Labor. Now, this has been confirmed to us again just in the last few days. So you can call Greens officers and they'll give you a hearing and listen to what you say, but you will inevitably eventually get from them, that's Senator Hanson-Young's portfolio area. She will have the largest say in what the Greens' decision on this will be. And whereas other parties will be getting feedback from all their members saying we're getting lots of calls. So what we have to do, I believe, is make sure that we hit the Greens with so many calls and emails that despite her having the main say because it's her portfolio area, and despite these prejudices that she has expressed, she gets a lot of her Senate colleagues saying to us, why are we getting so many calls on this? Hang on, is this worth it? What are we doing? And we put out a statement today which should be the most damn obvious thing for these morons. I can't believe that we have to say it. But the statement we put out today was, memo to the Greens, if you pass Albanese's mad bill, you will be censored too. And we've got 3 examples just in the last few months in our statement where the Albanese government, and people in his government have attacked the Greens, but the language they've used to attack the Greens is to accuse them of harmful misinformation. Bill Shorten said it when he attacked the Greens for opposing his NDIS reforms, and he said what the Greens are doing is harmful misinformation. Julian Hill, a bit of a rabbit of an MP yesterday, attacked the Greens because of the Greens opposed Labor's housing bills, and he accused them of misinformation that's harming the economy. And the big one was one of the biggest issues this year everyone can recognise is the conflict in Gaza, and that has been polarising around the world, including here in Australia. So the Greens have taken a very strong position on that, And that position has embarrassed the government because Albanese has actually spent his whole political career being pro-Palestine, but now he's in government. He's trying to walk the middle road and he's just pissing everybody off. Anyway, so out of rage, back on the 5th of June, Albanese got up and he launched an attack on Adam Bandt. And it was so fierce that Dutton got up afterwards and backed him up on it. So there you go. If Darth Vader Dutton liked what Albanese said, that's how over the top Albanese was. And his entire formulation for attacking the Greens was he said that the Greens are deliberately spreading misinformation that he then described in the way it's harmful to Australia. He said it is causing distress to immigrant communities that are closest to the conflict. And he said it is undermining Australia's social cohesion. That is the definition of harm that he expressed there. So he's accusing the Greens. Labor cannot attack the Greens, and they can't attack anybody really, without using this kind of language. They want to put a label on it. My argument is we've had thousands of years of political debates where all sides have always accused the other side of lying and being dishonest, but nobody has ever set up nobody except Hitler or whatever. You know, every now and then people set up a ministry of truth to become the arbiter of what is true or not. But for most of history, people have accepted, well, hang on, that's, you know, I've got a point of view. I think they're lying bastards. They've got a point of view. They're calling me a lying bastard. Let's let the public decide. But no, they're now they're trying to suppress debate by using language that assumes there's an independent factual set of facts that they get to decide what those are. And therefore, by just labeling something misinformation or disinformation, they can shut the debate down. And that's what they've been repeatedly doing against the Greens. So what are the Greens thinking? If Sarah Hanson-Young supports this bill, is she that stupid that she thinks this won't be used against them? Give me a break. Labor is hemorrhaging to the Greens. They would love to use this against the Greens. Right? This is the nature of this kind of censorship. It's actually bipartisan or politically blindness. It's just who is in power gets to use it, right? It's not going to be censorship against the left wing or censorship against the right wing. It's against opponents. That's how it works to consolidate the power of the existing authority. So people need to hammer the Greens on this. What are you thinking? Look at our press release. Use these examples. If they haven't connected the language to this bill, then they need to be read the Riot Act and what time of day it is, so they wake the hell up and not support this bill. And so my message to everyone who's concerned about this, call and email the Greens and don't relent until you see them shift their position.
No, very good point. And it's clear that the Greens are going to be in the crosshairs on this. And as you say, they don't often necessarily follow through and think about the implications. But I guess the other sort of side in all of this, in the bill at the moment, because of the way that it's directed at social media more than the mainstream media, it puts a lot of weight of emphasis on the social media companies effectively taking stuff down. Now, they'll be preemptive, as the hearings last Friday said. So there will be areas, topics that you will no longer be able to get coverage on social media. And that'll either be by shadow banning or outright removal of accounts. We saw quite a lot of that through the COVID period, so we know that that's what they do. And certainly if you look back over history, you can I think that many of the social media companies are very bad at actually effectively pruning the right things and, not pruning a whole lot of stuff. So remember that they're only interested in more eyeballs and more debate, or maybe even worse than debate. And frankly, of course, if you think like Twitter, they sort of push and push and push. And so, the more extreme views are, the more they like it because the more eyeballs they get. So there's an interesting debate here at the heart of it, because the very basis on which the social media platforms operate, which is on, eyeballs and on, frankly, noise, is being run right against what the Misinformation Bill is tackling. And I'm fascinated by this, but of course we know how the social media teams will react.
Well, they're a business at the end of the day. If they're required to preemptively suppress all this stuff, I mean, maybe one way they'll react is put more pornography on social media, make money that way. Because they'll run the risk of any discussion on politics could wander over into these areas, right? So we could, the three of us, given our record, we could flip into a discussion right now on the economy and why John Adams did a post today on Twitter warning about the inflation and how it's not under control. And so John Adams today undermined confidence in the financial markets, right? And we could elaborate on that. And the only way social media could deal with that is preemptively. They can't respond to it in real time. They've got to deal with it preemptively, right? So they'll have algorithms that can check the language and whatever, and suddenly, boom, the views drop, people, whatever they do, right, you can drop out. That's what they would have to do. And that goes against their business model, for sure, for sure. John may have something to say about this, but there is a perverse or an ironic part to this, which is also in Sarah Hanson-Young's statement that John referred to earlier, where she said she's raring to go to rein in the global tech giants, she called them. Well, the regulations that this bill puts on those global tech giants are regulations that only those giants could afford to comply with. They're actually quite onerous. And this, instead of taking them on, it would actually make it a closed shop. Startups, new startups, Australian startups. There was an Aboriginal group that made a submission to the inquiry that made the point an Aboriginal social media startup would never be able to afford to comply with those regulations. And so all you'll ever see is Facebook, Google, TikTok, X, and that's it. That's all we'll see from here on in. Whereas we've had this period of innovation in this area where new versions have come up. Telegram became very popular in COVID because Telegram got the reputation as the only platform that was uncensored. And look what's happened to Telegram's founder now, right? He's actually been reined in. No new platform will be able to make a breakthrough in this space. And is that what Sarah Hanson-Young wants?
Well, it's an interesting, and again, I think people aren't thinking through the consequences. And again, on the hearing on Friday, there was a huge debate about moderation and how moderation could work, should work, et cetera, et cetera. And, the net that I took out of that was that the current moderation systems and processes and the content checking isn't very effective at the best of times. And therefore, the concept of just extending it and expanding it is going to not be effective. And more and more people will probably get caught in the crossfire in the process. So to my mind, the original intent of what they're trying to do is actually not correct. And there was quite a good debate in Friday at one point about whether, in fact, this whole approach to misinformation and disinformation was in any way going to tackle the underlying issues that effectively people were trying to deal with in the first place, which I thought was quite amazing, really, because there was a realization that maybe the whole approach is completely flawed.
Well, the minute you suppress it, it convinces people it must be true. It's the oldest lesson about trying to censor anything. These are lessons that were learned centuries ago. I've got no respect for the politicians at all. I think they're lunatics. Like, there is a whole body of thought on this subject that goes back centuries. And if you go back to the voice referendum and how that experience is actually a direct motivator for this bill, because the government blamed the defeat of the voice on misinformation. This is how stupid the government is. In February, Michelle Rowland was giving an interview, and she cited that 70%, a poll that said 70% of Australians want action on mis and disinformation as a motivator for this bill. Except the poll she was talking about was taken straight after the voice referendum, when 70% of people said they were concerned about mis and disinformation. Except they interpreted that as 70% of people were blaming the outcome of the voice on misinformation, except 60% had voted against the voice. So the majority of those people, that 70%, were clearly not agreeing with the government's narrative that was the reason the voice failed. Well, they wouldn't have voted against it, right? It's actually this kind of evidence for this law is incredibly flimsy. They've just done another survey, by the way, which says Labor politicians are sending this around, citing an Australian Media Literacy Association survey. And the Australian Media Literacy Association is made up of a bunch of organisations, but the two media organisations on there are SBS and ABC, meaning the government-funded ones, the public ones. And so, more than a little bit self-serving. And they have a survey that claims 80% of Australians want mis and disinformation addressed, except when you look at the report that's based on, there was clearly a comprehensive survey where they were talking about all sorts of things like deep fake AIs and internet scams, etc. And of course, when you survey people, no one's going to, you'd have to be a psychopath to applaud disinformation. Of course, you're going to not approve of it, right? But that doesn't mean that result from that survey does not equate to 80% of Australians want censorship. But that's what the government is trying to fool people into thinking. And yeah, this is a very old lesson that they should have learned in the first time they did social studies or anything to do with political studies in high school or primary school even.
Absolutely. And it was interesting because the IPA trotted out some other research, I think, from what they've done, and they were showing that quite a few younger people were actually not that worried about the information flows, so it's about which statistics do you actually believe. And there's another example. The trouble is, statistics are often created by organizations who have a particular agenda in mind and will have a particular methodology in terms of the way that they collect the information, ask the questions, because surveys are not as objective as you might want to think.
No.
And, you can see that around the place. And I spend quite a lot of time in my surveys trying to make sure that we're trying to be as objective and as straightforward as we can be. But even there, there's a bunch of assumptions that I make around the way that people are thinking to be able to get a dialogue going, to be able to get the survey responses. So the point is, it's not a simple, straightforward process, and therefore every survey has innate biases. And those innate biases will be in the surveys, it'll be in the moderation processes, it will be in the organizations who are being funded and who are funding particular pieces of research. And, all of these think tanks and all of these lobby groups, they're all funded by somebody who has an agenda, and there's a reason why they're actually throwing the money in that particular direction. So if, the whole concept of there is a pillar of truth standing in splendid isolation, and if you stripped away all the misinformation, there is that pillar of truth with a light shining from this, which will be sort of sitting over the Canberra, over the Canberra building, shining out of the whole of Australia, is complete and utter nonsense. Truth isn't like that.
Yes, Martin. What I was going to say was that, it's very interesting you talk about survey results and data collection and methodology and biases, because I think Stephen Koukoulas has said that your DFA data set is basically mis and disinformation. I mean, he hasn't. Obviously, one of the big contentions is that you've said there's a level of stress in the economy. And you were saying that stress was very high even before COVID came into the equation. And a number of mainstream journalists and mainstream economists just said that they didn't believe your numbers. So your numbers, you say you got them from ordinary Australian households. And Koukoulas says, your numbers can't be true. So, the question then becomes did Martin North cook the numbers, or does his numbers reflect the objective truth? And Martin, I'll make one point, but you may want to, I guess, without going into too much detail, just provide a broad synopsis of your work in England, because you're producing numbers in England, and some people looking at your numbers and they're scratching their heads to say, well, how can North's numbers be real in England, let alone in Australia? So it's interesting that even your own methodology, your own data collection, people are saying that you've cooked your own numbers because of a preset narrative that you had, or a particular bias you wanted to push. And can you actually believe that so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, rental stress in the Australian data set is all about 79%. Mortgage stress is about 50%. And so, Martin, I think there was a recent series of seminars I did in Sydney and Melbourne where I actually had your graph on there, and I was actually saying that this is the level of cash flow harm in the economy according to the North data set, and things according to North looks very dire. I mean, 79% rental stress. I mean, again, your definition of stress is people don't have enough money to make ends meet on a cash in, cash out basis, and so how can it be that 4 out of 5 people renting in Australia don't have enough money to pay their bills? I mean, it's an extraordinary number. So I'll let you sort of talk about that. But the other interesting thing is about, I mean, Robbie was talking about the Greens, and we've sort of touched the point on, is mis and disinformation a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue? Is the left upset that they losing critical votes to the right, etc.? But one of the classic examples of what we were involved in 2019 was Mandurah. So Rob and I went to Mandurah, south of Perth. We did a show called The Economic Collapse of Mandurah, and we had the three of us were on the front page of the Mandurah Times. I believe that was the local newspaper. We were 2 weeks in a row. And the reality is that you had the mayor, who was independent but was associated with the ALP. You had the state member who was ALP. You had their federal member who was Liberal. They all said that our analysis of Mandurah was completely wrong. We were hyperbolic. We had no business being in Mandurah, given they were all from the East Coast. And we should shut our mouth. And yet the locals in Mandurah were emailing me and you, Martin, and they were contacting the Citizens Party, and Robert can attest to this. And they were saying that our videos were actually spot on. And so we were accused of mis and disinformation by the ruling elite. So the mayor, the state MP, the federal MP, and yet the citizens of the town said our analysis was correct. So, I mean, sometimes there is it's not a left-right issue. There's a uni-party consensus to shut out any bad news because they don't want bad news to be spoken about. So the Mandurah example is a classic example where the ruling elite, whether you're left or right, wanted certain information to be suppressed, and when we brought it to light, they just told us all to shut up, even though the local people in Mandurah knew what we were saying was correct. But Martin, how about we talk about your purported mis and disinformation? So according to your data set, 4 out of 5 people renting can't afford their bills, and 1 or 2 people with a mortgage can't afford their bills, including their mortgage. So Kakula says that the state of the Australian economy can't be that bad. What do you say to that?
Well, so there's a few things to unpack there. Firstly, of course, the definition of stress is the critical thing. So as I've explained many times, I look at it very early. So when people are having to make prioritizing decisions about what they spend their money on. So that's where I sort of measure it. The second is there was a report that came out, I think, the other day that said there were about 2 million households who were actually missing meals, and in some cases hadn't eaten for 24 hours just to try and get by. So there is clearly an underbelly of people in Australia who are having significant financial pressures. The third is that a lot of those...
Hang on, sorry to interrupt, but how many households in Australia? 9.8 million.
Okay,
9.8 million. So you cite 2 million out of 9 million, which would be roughly what, just over 20%?
Yep.
So 20% of dire straits is not the 80% rental stress, or the 50% mortgage stress.
But the point is that of that 9.8 million, a third has no mortgage or rent at all. So that takes it down to 6 million, right? And we know that those who are actually under more financial pressure tend to be more in the rental sector rather than in the mortgage sector. So when you start, unpeeling it, you can start seeing that there are different definitional points. But the point is there is an underbelly of pressure. But the UK example is quite interesting because I was hired. That's one of the reasons why I'm in the UK now. I was hired to deploy my survey methodology in the UK. And so I showed them the sort of results I got in Australia and explained the methodology. And I took them through the way I was thinking about it, the questions that I would ask, all of those things. And I deliberately didn't make any forecasts about what I would find in terms of when the data came through. And so I started to run the same program of analysis and started to get the same result. And guess what? We had quite high levels of pressure on households, not uniformly spread across the country, not all households the same, but not a million miles off what we're seeing in Australia. And it's interesting that the client I'm still working for at the moment started saying, well, that can't be right. I mean, that's so off what we thought from what the official information from the banks are saying. And then you sort of, well, hang on, what about this survey over here? And there was a survey that was done a little while ago in the UK that was quite similar to my findings, but just hadn't got a huge amount of coverage. So my point is that if you are actually in an area where you're looking for a different solution to what the truth is, then when you see information that just doesn't gel with what you think the truth is, you will automatically reject it. And that's been some of the battles. But just remember this, the UK is a new survey, but the survey in Australia has been running from 2001. For the first 10 years of that survey, I was collaborating with JP Morgan. And JP Morgan would publish the results in their official research. Now, that is something which is just worth reflecting. So they didn't think there was anything wrong with the methodology or approach. And you would hardly think that JP Morgan would have an agenda about trying to suppress information, or support information relating to households. So my point is, maybe it's a matter of who's the recipient of the information and what they do with it rather than actually the information itself. And that's the problem, actually, because survey information, whilst you can create it and there's a methodology, it's who interprets it and how it's interpreted. That's the real issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, how about I just say one provocative thing to sort of set Robbie off? When we talk about confronting when we talk about confronting information and how people don't want to hear certain things. Well, I don't know. This was a few years ago. Robbie was talking to me about the British massacres in India in the 19th century, and yet when you look at English history, so when you look at the history of India, there were massacres previous to the British that were larger in scale, according to the perpetrators, and they were more horrendous in terms of the massacres compared to what the British did in the 19th century. And I'm not here to be an apologist for the British, and obviously, Martin, you're
doing a good job.
But no. Till this day, Robbie is not prepared to accept that there were massacres before the British that were more horrific than what the British did in the 19th century. So even our dear friend Robbie, confronted with historical facts, just cannot bring himself to accept compared to a different a different reality.
Welcome to my world, dear viewer. This is what you just heard. There is a taste of the almost daily conversations at 6 o'clock in the morning I have with John Adams. We tend to tidy him up for an event like this, but there you go, John's gone there. But notice John called his claim facts. Well, that's an example of why we can't have an arbiter of truth, because if John believed that's facts, all I ever said to John was the claim that the first claim he hit me with was that the Mughal takeover of India, the Muslim conquerors killed 400 million Indians. And I just queried that on the basis of demographics, that there wouldn't have been 400 million to kill. And later on, and John said, yeah, but they claimed it did. And I said, yeah, they're big no to themselves. Doesn't mean that you can work the maths of demographics backwards, and it can't have been 400 million. So I think maybe there's a more realistic claim of 80 million. But anyway, let's put it this way. It's open to debate, and I don't mind debating it. Not in this forum. I think it's a waste of time. We've had it for 6 years with John and I. But if some bastard comes along and picks one side over the other and said that those are the facts, and the person who disagrees with those facts is pushing disinformation, then that's where we have a problem, right? That's why we shouldn't.
Hang on, Robbie. Hang on, Robbie. So can we like just on this point? So given that we're trying to dispel mis and disinformation, can we come to a resolution that while the British did commit massacres in the 19th century, they were not the worst in Indian history?
Oh. Well, as someone who's descended from Englishmen, John, I've learned over my history that I'm responsible for what my side and what my country does. So I think it's relative. What the British ended up doing in India for 250 years, which is now estimated to have plundered. The word loot is an Indian word. That's how extensive it was. It's estimated $45 trillion in today's money and wealth was looted by the British out of India. So it was pretty bad. You don't have to go to India to look for terrible massacres, because going back in history, they happened all over the world. But the thing is, when the British were doing it, they tended to go to church on Sundays and pretend they were holier than thou while they were doing it.
Well, that's part of the British character. And look, I'm in southwestern England, right? Just down the road is Bristol. Right. Bristol was built on the merchant venturers, right, or the slave trade, and the tobacco trade, and the activity that was just normal and supported created the wealth of the British. But around the world, of course, the consequences, well, we're still seeing it playing out today. Now, we're coming to the end of the show, but I just wanted to touch on one last thing. The third leg of the stool is universities. And, the fact of the matter is that under this legislation, mainstream media, politicians, and universities are allowed to say whatever they want, but everybody else isn't. So I just get a take from each of you on how appropriate it is for universities to be outside this this sort of legislation too. My take is they should absolutely, if this comes on board, they should be absolutely included, because some of the worst cases of bad analysis and frankly propagandizing comes from the university sector.
Totally. I mean, look, well, I was going to say, Martin, how about I start first? I mean, clearly, when we look at in terms of economics, I mean, the history of economics in this country is quite remarkable. I mean, prior to the 1930s, most Australian universities were teaching classical economics. So the Adam Smiths, the Alfred Marshalls, and the micro revolution of economics, that sort of stuff. No doubt would have been a test of Ludwig von Mises and others. And then as soon as John Maynard Keynes came on, all the universities dropped the classical economics, and we've had a domination of Keynes in all the universities for 90 years. And I mean, I spent $25,000 on a bachelor's degree and an honours degree in economics from the University of New South Wales and the University of Wollongong. And by the time I graduated, I was not prepared to accurately foresee the global financial crisis. Now, in 2006, I had an inkling something was about to happen because I was listening to certain media sources, but my economic training basically blindsided me because Keynes left out a number of critical factors in the economy, in terms of his economic model. And so, for example, things like debt features nowhere in the Keynes model. And this is a point that Stephen Keynes has made, that the modern understanding of economics is completely flawed, particularly macroeconomics, and there are different ways to look at it. So a lot of the analysis coming out of universities, particularly in the macroeconomic space, is just fundamentally wrong. And the other thing and when we come to mis and disinformation, I mean, one of the critical things that has been suppressed, and Martin, I hope we dive into this soon on the interest of the people, is John Maynard Keynes was a pedophile. And there are historical accounts of him being a pedophile. And, prior to his death in in the late 1930s, early 1940s, he was the president of the British Eugenics Society. So he was a sexual deviant, child molester, and then he believed in the same radical eugenic racial theories that Hitler did, and supposedly he's dominated Australian university economic thought for 90 years. At some point, we need to, get Keynes out of this country, and we need to actually teach people proper economics, so that they can actually understand what's really going on. Because when you listen to, the Treasury, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the bank economists, most of these people have no idea. And I'll just finish on this point. I mean, in 2020, Martin, you and I did shows on in the interest of the people, and I said we're going to have stagflation. We're going to have inflation is going to go out of control, and middle class Australians is going to get squeezed, and that's why your rental and mortgage stress statistics have gone through the roof. And yet, by 2022, Michelle Bullock tells the Senate, who could have foreseen the inflation? No one could have foreseen it. It was a complete shock to everyone. And yet, I knew I'd called it 2 years earlier, because I had realized that my economics training was deficient. I had around 2008, 2009, 2010, I had listened to, I learned about Austrian economics, Ludwig von Mises. I was following Ron Paul, who was running for the US presidency, and who was a advocate of sound monetary economics. And I had to retrain myself. And as I tell a lot of economic students now, it took me 10 years to get those Keynesian ideas out of my head, and so that I could actually understand economics properly. And that's why in the last 5-6 years, Martin, as we've done various shows on different economic topics, I think my analysis is much more accurate today compared to 20 years ago, because I saw the errors of my ways. And so, I mean, there's a whole host of, once you get into the art faculties across the Australian university sector, most of it is propaganda, particularly when there's no need for empirical evidence, and it's all just subjective opinion. That's what the humanities is full of that stuff. But particularly in terms of the areas that we tend to focus on, the university sector is just shocking. And the other thing I'd say is most undergraduate students are being financially fleeced, so that they can actually you have a whole bunch of people in the elite, particularly left-wing academics and politicians, and now Bill Shorten is now going to be the vice chancellor of the University of Canberra. They get all these plum positions to push their political agenda and their political ideology at the same, and they're trying to make it out to be legitimate economic or academic research. And yet, this whole model of propaganda is being financed by undergraduate students who are being charged for worthless degrees, and people are drowning in students are drowning in debt, and they are forced to spend 10, 15 years of their working life paying back these student loans. And I had a student loan when I went through university, and it took me more than a decade to pay off my student loan. And I realized that now I would say that the economic training was useful in one sense. I can now see where the establishment. So when mainstream media or mainstream economists make a statement, I know why in many cases they think the way they do, but also I know why they're wrong. So in some sense that is actually helped me try to understand how to pick truth from in terms of falsehood. But no, this whole university sector is young Australians being financially fleeced, and all this money, not only domestic students but foreign students as well, being financially fleeced. And then you get a whole bunch of particularly left-wing elites. I mean, like if you look at most of the, for example, the Canberra Press Gallery, a lot of left-wing journalists go into academia, and then they're getting a university salary to continue pushing their left-wing ideas. And also you see, senior officials in the Commonwealth Public Service going on to positions of being vice chancellor or chancellor around various universities, and you think to yourself, well, should you actually be in these roles? And so the whole university model has completely taken us down the wrong path. And these institutions are no longer institutions of excellence. And so absolutely, they should be a part of this regime if this regime is going to come into being. But on the other hand, I think we need fundamental reform of the university sector so that a lot of this fake research can be thrown out, because it's being financed at the expense of young, gullible, naive students.
Absolutely. Well, we're nearly at the end of the show. Robbie, I want to come back to you finally and just ask you this question. So over the next few weeks, as this process continues, what is the lever that we should be pulling? And, what should we be doing as interested and, concerned citizens of Australia to help steer the agenda?
Well, certain things will come up which we'll publicise as they come up, and that might inform different tactics on what to do. But for now, I'm convinced it's maximum pressure on the Greens and the Independents. So, like I'd say to the viewers tonight, get out your phone, get out your computer, send emails to the Greens and Independents in your state, and that'll be 2 or 3 or 4. And then send it to the rest of them as well. So we've got a release that we put out today that has links to those sections of the Parliament website where you can see all the Green senators' details, all the Independent senators' details. I think there's 6 independents. If you're in Tassie, chuck in Jackie Lambie as well. She's just that she's not listed in the Independents because she's technically part of a party, the Jackie Lambie Network. But that's for Tasmanian viewers. But we need to see a shift in the Greens. So despite what I've said today, officially they haven't taken a decision yet, right? So they are weighing up what they're going to do. And now's the time to strike and strike hard. And that doesn't mean being nasty, but it means being pointed with the sort of things that we've put in our release today. There's no way they're being warned by the government through the government's language that they're going to be a target of this, right? And if it takes you to remind them, and it might, you should be the person to remind them. Make that call and keep the pressure on. Now, so watch out for if you follow us on social media, between the 3 of us, John's on LinkedIn and Twitter. What else are you on, John? Mainly those 2. Telegram. John's a very lively person on Telegram. I'm on Twitter, and we have a weekly show on YouTube. The Citizens Party is on all the platforms. Martin, you do very regular stuff, etc. So between the 3 of us, people will be updated on different initiatives that come up. So look out for those. But I think I'm a little bit pessimistic that appealing to reason in the Greens is going to work. It may work. We'll do our best, but while we're doing that, it helps to have a huge amount of people contacting them and making it very clear to them, hang on, if you let this go through, then you'll pay the consequences politically, because that's insane, including for yourself. So that's what I would strongly suggest for now. Right.
Thank you very much, Robbie. And John, back to you finally. Interest of the people, we're going to hopefully do a few more shows ahead.
Yes. Well, we shall indeed. The one unfortunate thing, Martin, is that my computer is in the computer shop. So I've got a couple of technical issues that I have to resolve, and so hopefully by the end of this week I'll get the computer back, and we'll be able to sort of get back to exposing the dark secrets of ASIC. And over the last couple of years, one of the most prolific purveyors of mis and disinformation has been ASIC. They are the masters of concealing the truth, and they are masters of portraying that they are an effective law enforcement agency when they clearly are not.
Yeah, very good point. Well, I look forward to that. Hope you get your computer sorted out. And I want to say thank you to both of you for coming on and sharing your thoughts this evening. And I've put links and things below for people if they want to follow up. We'll keep this very much in mind over the next few weeks as this progresses. And obviously we'll hopefully continue to raise the issues and direct it as appropriately. So, John, thank you very much for your time this evening. Good to see you are name to face. Robbie, thank you very much indeed for your time as well.
No worries, Martin.
We look forward to keeping in touch. Yeah. Keeping in touch and keeping the story going. I'm going to take you both offline now, and I'm going to close the show. So there you go, folks. Hope you enjoyed that very interesting conversation from both Robbie and John. And just to say that next week, Leith Van Onselen will be on. We're going to be talking about some of the economic stuff that's been going on and some of the shenanigans there. The dogs, well, I can show you half a dog because only one dog is, the other dog is by my side at the moment. She wants her lunch, so that's my next objective. But check out my shows over the next few days. We put them up daily, of course, and we'll be back live next Tuesday as well. So thank you very much indeed for spending some time with us this evening. Thank you very much for all the super chats. Greatly appreciated from all of those who have contributed to helping with the show. Thanks for all the comments as well. And look forward to seeing you in the show live next Tuesday. This is Martin North from Digital Finance signing off. We'll see you next time. Take care.